Perfect.
Welcome back to a special Valentine's Day edition of Archaeology After Dark, everyone. Unfortunately, we don't have archaeology of Valentine's Day. I'm going to have to work on how to excavate a major holiday. That's going to be tricky. My guest today is Dr. Megan LeBlanc. Megan, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm currently the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA coordinator at Auburn University at Montgomery. I've been in this role for about a year and a half or so now. I started in August of 2023, and before that, I got my master's and PhD at the University of Florida. Where I actually was trained in NAGPRA at the Florida Museum, but my research was actually in the Andes, so in far southern Peru. And so I've gotten to do a lot of different things throughout my career in archaeology, which has been interesting and fun. But currently, I'm kind of more in the NAGPRA realm, in terms of what I do day to day.
Yeah, and that brings us to what we're talking about today. So, as some of you may not know, the standards or the legal, I guess, language of NAGPRA has changed in the past, I'd say probably year or so. It actually went into effect.
Yeah, so it was last January, so a little bit over a year now.
Yeah. So, I thought it would be a good idea for people to who haven't seen the updates or heard about the updates to get a little bit of a video tutorial instead of having to read through the numerous pages to actually explain it because
Yeah, it's a
it is
pretty dense document.
it's a lot of words,
Yep.
but it's a necessary and appreciated update in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even though it was one that some universities were kind of scrambling to kind of figure out and to hire personnel in order to help get them into compliance, it's been a good clarification in terms of the regulatory process to help universities and tribal nations to be able to better work towards repatriation.
So, from a legal standpoint, how has NAGPRA changed with the new implementations?
Yeah, so with the new regulations, there was a couple of updates and changes. One of the biggest ones that the National NAGPRA program was trying to do was to actually clarify the process, because NAGPRA was first passed in 1990, and there's still so many ancestors, and that's what word I'm going to use kind of moving forward for Native American human remains, that are still in institutions, in museums that have never been repatriated. And so they wanted to first start by kind of clarifying the process for repatriation and those return of ancestors and cultural items. So one of the biggest changes were the new deadlines that were associated with the regulations. And so one of the first ones that has recently actually come up was that institutions were required to report to federal agencies within a year of the passing of those regulations. So this would have been this past January, if they had federal collections. So that just passed. We also have new deadlines associated with publishing inventories and summaries. So if you acquire or you find a collection, you have 2 years to complete the inventory process. And then if you have you have human remains that were not published in a notice, you have 5 years from the regulatory deadline to be able to report those to National NAGPRA. So it didn't exactly restart the clock, but it created new deadlines in order to kind of, I guess, try to make sure that universities and institutions that are subject to NAGPRA were actually doing the work and working towards repatriation instead of just relying on some of the documentation that they submitted in the 1990s when NAGPRA was first passed.
And
Some other, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I would imagine that, the 5 year or 2 year deadline reduces some of the strain on the universities and museums to become compliant. But at the same time, these institutions have hundreds, if not thousands, of items they have to go through in that 2 year or 5 year period.
Yeah, and it's tricky because from an institutional standpoint, we definitely feel the pressure here at AUM, and it's not just an AUM problem; it's something that's a nationwide problem, just because it hasn't always been a priority for universities. And so there is that pressure to get it completed, but also, at least for myself, I like having deadlines because it helps me to kind of create a work plan to decide, how I'm going to go through this work and make sure that I get it done in a timely fashion. So I think, I think it's a good thing to have these new deadlines. And I think it was also helpful because several institutions across the US didn't have dedicated personnel that were working towards NAGPRA. And so it was a way to have within anthropology departments or within museum departments or kind of however the institution is organized to be able to ask upper administration for a new line to be able to support the NAGPRA work because having a dedicated person or a team of people working on it is really, really useful in order to be able to make the deadlines.
So, what happens, like, say, an institution is unable to meet the deadline? Can they ask for an extension, or is there like a fine or something related to it? I probably should know that working in a
Yeah,
museum.
no, no, you can ask for for an extension. So you could do that with the original regulations. You could ask for a deadline initially in the 1990s, and they still have that ability to do so. However, if there are also civil penalties that are associated with not being in compliance, that does require someone to report an institution or a museum that is not in compliance. So both are possible, but you can ask for that extension if your institution really does need it. I'm really hoping here that we'll be able to get the work done in time, not need the extension, but it is nice to know that there is that option.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, with the new NAGPRA regulations, the penalty has increased also, hasn't it?
I think that's correct. There's like a minimum threshold, and I don't know exactly how much that is. And then they kind of review the case through the NAGPRA review committee, and kind of determine what that monetary amount would be.
So who's responsible for enforcing NAGPRA? I assumed it was the National Park Service or something along those lines, but this takes like a dedicated effort to make this process actually work.
Yeah, so it falls under the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service, and then there's the National NAGPRA program. And so there's a team of individuals that's led by Melanie O'Brien, who's the National NAGPRA program manager, that are the ones that have been doing the work to receive all the different documentation, notices, inventories, summaries, those types of things, and get those published, as well as they run the National NAGPRA Grants Program, and they have a lot of really useful trainings and guides and things on their website to help folks through this process.
So for people who are unfamiliar with NAGPRA, like say they've never actually gone through the NAGPRA process for their museum, how do they actually get started to do it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variety in kind of how people get started. I know when I started this job in August of 2023, I was the first NAGPRA coordinator at AUM. So Auburn University at Montgomery and main campus Auburn had submitted inventories and summaries in the 1990s to meet that deadline. However, since then, they really hadn't done too much consultation and there hadn't been an actual repatriation of any ancestors or cultural items. And so when I first got here, the first thing I did was send out introductory emails to any of the tribal nations that I thought could be potentially affiliated with our collection, just to introduce myself and get that conversation going. Because I knew that in order for me to be able to successfully do this work and to do it in a timely fashion, the Native American tribes needed to know who I was and that I was here and actively doing the work, especially at a smaller regional university that sometimes gets overshadowed by the bigger campus. I wanted to make sure that folks knew that we had our own archaeology lab, we had our new NAGPRA coordinator, and that we were actively working towards repatriation. So sent some introductory emails, set up some introductory calls and Zoom meetings, and had a conversation with them about with the different tribal nations and their representatives about what some of their priorities were and how was the best way for me to go about this work. Because I had done NAGPRA work at the Florida Museum. I was a graduate student at the time, and so I had a smaller role in terms of what I was doing NAGPRA wise, but I wanted to make sure that every step of the way Our consulting tribal nations were not only informed of what we were doing, but had given me some advice on how was the most appropriate and respectful way to do so. And so that was really my starting point. And then in terms of working in our lab, because we are not more of a traditional museum, we don't have like a registrar or a collections manager that had really kept detailed records of what we had. And so one of my first steps in terms of understanding our collection was just to see what sites we had. So I went box by box to get an inventory of all the different sites that we had in our lab, and then started to go through the different files that we had, mostly undigitized, but we do have some digitized files, but mostly they're kind of in large filing cabinets, to see which sites might be sites that could have ancestral remains, and should be kind of a good starting point. So that was really how I got started. It really probably depends on the institution, what type of facility you have, and what your records look like. But I do think starting off with that consultation piece to make sure that people know who you are, know who is working with their ancestors and handling their ancestors, is a great way to start building those relationships with tribal nations to make it smoother to go through the process long term.
So this is a more of a personal question. You moved here from Florida. Did you, I imagine, building relationships with tribes when you first get to a position like yours has its challenges just because they don't know who you are, you don't know them, and it takes time to build like a relationship between the two.
Yeah, it definitely is tricky, and it takes some perseverance because especially when I started, even though the new NAGPRA regulations hadn't dropped yet, they were getting there, and people were kind of anticipating that they were coming. And so definitely a lot of the tribal nations that we consult with recently have been very inundated with summaries, notices, those types of things. And so they're very, very, very busy, just like we are on the institutional side. And so it's always important to kind of acknowledge that and think about how many folks that they're consulting with and constantly getting emails from. I also have found that being in the Southeast, particularly because most of the tribal nations are removed tribes and are not actually physically located in the state of Alabama, that makes things tricky as well, because you can't just go and like visit. We do have one federally recognized tribe in the state of Alabama, but most of the folks that we end up consulting with are either now located in Oklahoma or Louisiana or Texas or Florida. And so that distance requires us to rely a little bit more on Zoom meetings or phone calls. But I found that even one of the things that was helpful for me is I started off with emails and waited to see like who would reply, started to set up calls, and then I would start actually just kind of calling different offices to introduce myself and saying like, is this a good time for us to speak? I would just like to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about who I am, so that maybe you're a little bit more comfortable with the work that I'm doing. But it definitely is challenging when people aren't geographically close to you, to build those relationships. And we have a lot more virtual meetings than I would prefer because it is really nice, obviously, to be able to speak in person and to meet in person. But it just, requires transparency and persistence in terms of reaching out in good faith to be very honest about where you are in the NAGPRA process.
Yeah, and I think honesty and I guess transparency go a long way. And I guess digital technology kind of helps with that. So
Hmm.
they can see you, you can see them, and you can actually like show them the object or artifact that you're actually talking about if you have questions instead of like having to spend like the 3 days for a digital picture to get to them.
Yeah, it definitely, with people getting more comfortable with Zoom meetings, even though I think we were all pretty Zoom fatigued after 2020, 2021, and probably still Zoom fatigued. But it definitely is a helpful tool to be able to have those video conferences. And so, like you said, we can talk somewhat face to face. And then you can also, if people have requests about seeing things, really depends on the person, individual person, and then also the tribal nation kind of what their policies are there. But it is a very useful tool instead of just having to email back and forth because emails get lost. I mean, we all get so many emails a day. So having the ability to have Zoom calls is definitely helpful. And I think especially with the new regulations, really emphasizing deference to tribal nations, that consultation key and being able to be in constant communication with our tribal partners is essential, not only for doing the work that's required by the regulations, but also making sure that we're being very respectful when it comes to handling ancestors and funerary objects and things like that, because they can give us some advice on how's the best way to do so.
Yeah, and I guess moving forward, new regulations or people reconsidering how the regulations are phrased, this is just me personally. I think this is a step in the right direction because it helps repair and rebuild trust just in the community as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And, NAGPRA can be a traumatic process for a lot of tribal representatives just because they're dealing with their ancestors and their human remains that are in these facilities that have not always been housed very appropriately because of research ideas or goals or things like that. But at the same time, like you said, can be very healing. And it's been really wonderful to build those relationships and to see that even though we're still in the process of getting things repatriated, and we have a published notice now here at AUM, but we haven't physically actually um, done a repatriation yet. It's still nice to see that the work that we're doing is appreciated and that we are trying to heal some past wounds that were done through the excavation or potential mishandling of human remains in the past. And I think that is a really wonderful thing to see as an archaeologist.
Yeah, that's something I've really started to, I wouldn't necessarily say humbling, but it is very like inspiring as an archaeologist to learn from people's past mistakes. Like a lot of the early archaeology here in Alabama was done in the 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't always done as ethically as it could have been, mostly
Mhm.
because we didn't have the regulations we have now. But, it's nice to see that I'm actually, in the field making something better, like trying to repair something that's been damaged, and that I can actually do that as an archaeologist is amazing.
Yeah. Well, and collaboration makes our work better. The more we know about the past, whether that's coming from our excavations, whether that's coming from traditional cultural knowledge, oral histories, any of that adds to the rich history of Alabama. And so the more we know, the better. And I think those collaborations are making for really cool projects in this state and throughout the United States to have more inclusive voices in archaeology for sure.
Yeah, and it's also a great opportunity for students to learn and
Mm.
see how their work actually influences the field and what they're learning in the classroom. They can actually put it to a proactive or just an active use, depending on their situation. But they can actually see how their work changes the field or perceptions of the field. Like we're not just out digging just randomly with a shovel. We're actually returning things and building relationships with the community.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's been a good reality check too for archaeology because there's a lot of laboratories, collections facilities and stuff that have needed some love, that have either been understaffed or have not been updated to archival standards or the standards that are respectful for our tribal partners. And so teaching students to not only be ethical in the field, but also to consider, okay, once something is pulled out of the ground, what happens to it? That it's not just a tool for research, but these are things that belong to people in the past. And we are the current caretakers of those items. So it's important that we have ethical practices once we get into a collection space to take care of these individuals and these items until they're either repatriated or depending on where you work or what you work on, once you can, so that they are usable in the future as either research potential or also for teaching collections or whatever. Because I think a lot of collections and a lot of things that were pulled out of the ground in the past were really neglected, and that's unfortunate as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, part of that's like the weird, like humbling thing of being an archaeology student is you do have to go like clean other people's actual mistakes. Like this is a piece of pottery. It came out of the ground in the 80s and it's gross and I just have to
hmm
scrub it just very lightly with a toothbrush, just very lightly with the toothbrush.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, it's funny as students I feel like go through lab and they're like, "Oh, so today we're just like labeling bags." And I'm like, "Yeah, but to be able to know what the provenience is of this item is so important for the future. Otherwise, if we don't know where it came from, then it just kind of gets lost in the shuffle of all the artifacts that we have in a space." And so, teaching them about the significance of taking care of the items that we are excavating is, I think, cool, even if they don't always appreciate it initially.
Yeah, it's kind of weird seeing like students when the reality of archaeology like hits them like, wait, we're not running through the jungle or getting shot at while we do it? No, not really.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody's shooting at you, then you probably shouldn't be wherever you are, but that's beside the point.
A little different, not quite action stars, but I do think, especially with NAGPRA, and a lot of the shifts that I see in anthropology and archaeology in general are really positive ones. And so I'm really excited to see what the next generation of archaeologists will do and how exciting and collaborative their projects are going to be. Because I think there's going to be a lot of valuable information coming out with the generation of undergrad students that we're working with here. So. I think it's exciting for sure.
Yeah, so we've talked about how this affects people in the field, like in museums or universities or things. How does the NAGPRA regulations affect people, just like everyday people? I know that's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah, I think probably the most noticeable change maybe some folks are seeing is changes to museums and exhibits. So one of the other things that came out with the new regulations was a new duty of care requirements that requires consultation to be able to safeguard ancestors and cultural items, consultation when you are assessing your protocols for like storage, treatment, handling of ancestors and cultural items, as well as consent before any sort of research or exhibition on ancestors or cultural items. And so several museums throughout the US have started to reassess their collections and reassess the exhibits that they have and rethink how they display items that or taking down items that may be subject to NAGPRA and starting to incorporate exhibits that may have more like modern Native American artists displaying their pottery or things like that. I know several museums have also added areas where they talk specifically about NAGPRA, and so they say like, oh, this area is being taken down, or there's work being done to this particular exhibit because we are working to repatriate the things that were in this current hall. Let me tell you about NAGPRA so that you understand why this is important. We're not just staring at like a blank space in a museum, but we're actually doing an ethical practice that should have been done, 30 years ago when NAGPRA was first passed. And so I would imagine that's probably one of the first things that maybe the public is kind of noticing in terms of specifically the new regulations associated with NAGPRA. Other than that, I think other ways in general, I think the world is becoming more aware and more sensitive to these types of ethical practices in terms of understanding that when it comes to understanding the past and doing archaeological excavations, even though we may have this idea of kind of what are the cool artifacts or, that it's pulling stuff out of graves is where all the very like valuable things are located. I'm hoping that folks are starting to get an idea of reassessing that and thinking about, oh, these Native American tribes are still here. These are people that still exist. that still are tribal nations that have sovereignty within the United States, and that it's important that we consider their ancestors just like we would want someone to consider if someone was digging up a cemetery that was related to our ancestors. So I would hope that that's something that is being learned, but I would imagine one of the more noticeable effects is probably some things that are having to do with different museum exhibits across the US.
Yeah, the exhibits is a great point that you bring up. I forgot what museum it was, but they did a repatriation exhibit right after COVID or the quarantine ended, and they were in the process of updating their NAGPRA compliance. And when they removed something, they removed the object but left a description of what it was, but also under that why they could no longer display it. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, well, and I know places like specifically in Alabama, Alabama Department of Archives and History has been working really hard in consultation with tribes to reassess their collections and to not only get things repatriated, but work on a brand new exhibit. I think several like was it the McClung at University of Tennessee, Knoxville has done some really interesting things with having displays that actually explain NAGPRA. And so I think that's becoming more of the norm, which is great, and a good teachable moment for students. Even I think I don't remember if it was this last year or the year before at Moundville, because they've recently been working on repatriating their ancestors as well. But they had some conversations about NAGPRA going on within their museum as well, which is awesome to get, especially during the like Moundville Festival, to have young students that are coming in and really starting to understand that like, oh, there is this federal law that exists, and this is why it exists and why it's important.
Yeah. So we're about out of time. For anybody who wants to get involved in archaeology or wants to learn more about NAGPRO, what would you recommend for them?
Yeah, so like I said, the National NAGPRA program has a lot of really good resources on their website. So they have some video links. They also have some printout and handouts that kind of summarize the regulations so you don't have to read the entire law. And so those are really helpful. I've also seen several different podcasts where people have had guests on to kind of explain NAGPRA. So it's definitely getting out there in terms of lots of different types of media, depending on what type of learner you are, if you're interested in NAGPRA. There's also several NAGPRA community of practices. There's a large national one, and then there's some regional ones as well. And you can look up their websites online and start to get a feel for who's doing NAGPRA and kind of what's going on. And a lot of them have either like monthly or quarterly meetings where they'll have those discussions. And then as far as getting involved in archaeology, I didn't really know a lot about archaeology until I got into undergrad. I was always into history, but I didn't really realize that archaeology was, a career I could actually have until I got into undergrad. But there are opportunities in a lot of states where they have public archaeology programs where they have students can come out like K through 12 and get to experience some archaeology. But if you're an undergrad, take an archaeology class. Most universities do have intro to archaeology classes. That's what hooked me. And obviously, here I am years later. I'm not going to say how many years after grad school later, but years later, still pursuing a career in archaeology. And it's been very, very rewarding. So lots of opportunities.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed that people, when they get into archaeology, they don't notice it right away because it takes them, like a year or two to actually get their feet wet in a career in archaeology. But it is an incredibly rewarding job. Like
Mhm.
it's wonderful.
Yeah. And there's a lot of good people that
Shameless self
do,
promotion of the field, everybody.
yeah, a lot of good people that do archaeology that are doing really cool work, not just you in the US, but like around the world. So it's definitely a career that can take you other places too, if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, so that's going to do it for us today. Megan, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed having you on. This has been a really great episode.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate it.
All right, happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Bye.